John, can you create an issue and me or Roman will take a look on it?
Sure. And I'll put the output in there.
Awesome. So this is the KubeVirt community meeting, March 6, 2019. The discussion that started there was just a little follow-on from a bug we had mentioned since the meeting was starting. The agenda and notes is kind of light, so if anybody has anything to add, we'll take it in stride as we continue. Just a quick note on anti-affinity in the virtual or KubeVirt pods. The background to this is that we don't have any means right now. We're not using a daemon set, and so with our deployments, we don't have any means to make sure that pods aren't being hosted on the exact same node. This is obviously, if the point of having tuned pods for high availability, if that's the point, there's absolutely no reason to have them on the same node, because if that node goes down, you lose all the pods. So we're looking at introducing some anti-affinity there. The pull request is 2089. More to follow on that since it's a work in progress. But this, there are different opinions on how this could be solved. We could have used a daemon set as opposed to a deployment. But if we're going to continue this way, then we need to actually do due diligence and put in affinity rules so that they don't appear on the same node. On networking, do we have any updates from that side of the team?
Something to the anti-affinity discussion.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, well, one issue which we will always have if we only offer deployments and not also the daemon sets, which would then start on master, we would always be much less available than Kubernetes itself. If you, for instance, have zones or something, then, I mean, it can always happen that even though our pods are on different nodes, they are still all in the same zone, and when that one is disconnected, Kubernetes itself can immediately continue working because you have master nodes in all zones, but all our pods would be down. They would then have to be pulled down, started again in the other zone. So I personally really think that on deployments which offer the possibility to see master nodes, we should really strive for scheduling all our control plane on the master nodes. By default, scale it with them so that we have the same availability.
So it's about the fact that if we use daemon sets, the pod will already be standing up as new zones are available, as opposed to needing to be manually moved in reaction to issues.
Yeah, so I mean, also in the other case, it will recover, but depending on how huge our images are, how accessible the registries are in case of failures already, it can take a long time until KubeVirt comes back up if it soon disappears. If we have a daemon set which by default scales with the master nodes, then we have our infrastructure already on all crucial places by default. And it will just continue like the rest of the Kubernetes control plane. Otherwise, we can, of course, improve the situation by adding anti-affinity. So I'm not in general against just adding the preferred anti-affinity right now, but it doesn't solve the whole picture. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also that there are managed clusters outside which don't even allow you to see the master nodes. For instance, if you on the public cloud, on GCE, request a cluster, you normally don't see master nodes, just your worker nodes. So therefore, I think we need to offer both. But for real bare metal installations, we should offer daemon sets. That's at least my opinion.
I think that using preferred during scheduling, preferred during execution may be the wrong approach because it doesn't actually solve anything. The issue is that if you have
you can also use the other one, the required one, but then our operator has to check how many nodes are there at all. Otherwise, it will not even start. That's the main thing.
Absolutely. But the problem with preferred during scheduling is that if at any given moment there's only one node on the cluster, all of the components will get scheduled there anyway because they're preferred during scheduling. It's allowed to be done.
Yeah,
and it doesn't solve anything. So
that's fine for me too. I mean, it's just that the operator needs then to be aware of it, and if more nodes are added, it needs to scale the deployment by hand. I mean, it's an operator, so it's not by hand, but yeah.
In other words, a daemon set is much simpler.
Yeah, but I mean, you have to do it right once, right? Because there are always taints on master nodes. You have to ensure that you have all of them, but then it's much simpler.
All right, I think that, are there any questions on that, or have we covered that? Okay, moving on. From the networking side, are there any updates that the team would like to provide?
I don't think we have something interesting right now.
Okay, thank you. And from the community side, is there anything that we want to mention? Documentation, user interface, or user experience? All right, are there any other topics for the agenda and notes today?
I do have something actually on the community side, Stu,
Okay.
and it's the fact that at the moment regarding the user guide, our understanding was that more or less every developer is responsible for providing the documentation of any feature that he had, but we don't know if we should also maybe be the group taking care of the user guide as a whole and making sure that it's adequate from an end user perspective. So I don't know what's the take, or what's your take on that? And by you, I mean everyone.
I think we can take that offline.
Okay. That's fair.
Okay, so we'll discuss that on the mailing list. Perfect. For the open floor, just a reminder, I assume we're done with the agenda at this point? Okay. For the open floor section, just a reminder that daylight savings for the United States is taking effect this weekend, which will cause a time delay or a time switch so that it'll be 11 a.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. CET for next week's meeting. And we have a note about VM snapshot API.
Yeah, that was me. Let's see who's on the call here. Is Petter on here? Yeah, I see him.
Yes, I'm here. What would you like to address?
Sure. So I looked at the document a little bit. I guess the concern I would raise to the open floor is when we're looking at, just from a high level, the VM snapshot objects that we need to introduce to support offline snapshots or live snapshots for that matter. There's two aspects to this. There's the request to create a snapshot, and then there's the actual snapshot content. So the way Kubernetes has handled this so far, and this is even reflective in their snapshot API for volumes, is they have the request, which is the snapshot, and then the another resource that's the actual content. I think it's called snapshot content. And that's another pattern that they use for persistent volumes and persistent volume claims. So persistent volume claim being the request, and then it's fulfilled by the creation of the PV if PV didn't already exist. So when I'm looking at our API, I think we fall within that same pattern where we might need two objects. And I just kind of wanted to get people's thoughts on that because right now we're going for a single object, it looks like in the design, but that doesn't really necessarily mesh well with the current Kubernetes ecosystem patterns that we have. Does that make sense?
It does, and I can answer that.
Okay.
We had precisely the discussion last week on the synchronization meeting, where we asked John Griffith, who was part of the design of the snapshotting, volume snapshots, and the volumes in the Kubernetes. And the fact that Kubernetes has these objects split separately is due to the fact that they want to allow having the request in a different, no, it was the volume that they wanted in the different namespace. And the request should be always paired with, in the same namespace as the object that will use it. The fact is that when I specifically asked if we should follow this pattern, the answer was no if we do not require to have it split across the namespaces, which we do not. The request and the result will always be in the same namespace as the virtual machine that's being snapshotted. Therefore, we simplified our lives and went for a single object. This was the thinking behind placing both objects into a single one. And it was taken into a consideration.
Okay, that makes sense to me that they had to split because one, the request is namespaced and the actual content of a volume snapshot, I guess, is unnamespaced. So they have to be in two separate objects. Okay, so if we use a single object, I guess my concern is kind of how the API is structured then. We have most Kubernetes objects have a spec field, which is something that the user modifies themselves when they post the object. And then we have a status field, which is kind of where the result and the status tracking and all that occurs. It's kind of, we have to somehow record the result of this snapshot in a way that's consistent with API, Kubernetes APIs today. So does the result actually belong in the status field? Would that make the most sense? I don't know how to make that consistent, I guess.
In my mind,
at least just here we have a good example. For instance, we got from certificate requests. When you have a certificate signing request, you also have in the spec what you want, including the unsigned certificate, and in the status you get then the signed one if it's there. So I think it makes sense to have it in status in general.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, but I haven't really, yeah.
Yeah, that also goes in hand with the fact that, I mean, the pull request is still not merged, but in Kubernetes in general, it always works like this, that the spec can be modified by users and the status is protected. So, I mean, it looks like when you do a patch or an update on core objects from Kubernetes, like, I fetch the whole object, I change my stuff in spec and post spec and status. But that's actually not true. The API server just ignores the status. There's an extra status sub-resource and only the system has access to it. And we need the same thing.
Okay, so that would be my advice. I'll go revise my comment to reflect that we need a spec section that is essentially what I guess you have in the config part of the API right now. And the actual spec that's generated as a result of the snapshot should go in the status section, which is something that is only written by the system. But yeah, that's my most immediate feedback there.
Great, that was roughly how I imagine it. I didn't figure out the naming, but thanks, Roman, for pointing that out. If you can pinpoint that in the comments, and I will update that. Thank you.
Okay, that's all I had.
All right, thank you. Any other questions on that? Any other topics for the open floor today? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. We will meet again next week, and remember the time change. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.